G'day guys, welcome to Gray's Builds, Project BREWTUS. The next instalment, the tail shaft. In this episode I'm going to be dropping the exhaust system out, pulling the tail shaft out, replacing the center bearing and the front and rear dampener connectors, rubber connectors, and I'll do it in a little bit more of a tutorial style to help people do it, save yourself some money. Cheers. Okay, here's the replacement rubber dampers and the center bearing. These regularly crack and fail after a long period of time, especially given their proximity to the exhaust system. They get a lot of heat soak, and rubber doesn't like heat soak and then cooling, and they're 16 years old, the originals. So I can't wait for the day that I've got a hoist. Obviously jack the vehicle up and put it on jack stands. Never use a jack, never get under a vehicle on a jack. Give yourself enough space to get underneath in a mechanic's creeper. I need a new one of them, by the way. And first step is to support the exhaust system with the jack. So the jack's not actually supporting the car there, it's just supporting the exhaust system. Disconnect the exhaust. Okay, this is pretty hard to film obviously, but disconnect the two flanges of the exhaust so the header pipes stay in the car. Each exhaust will be slightly different. Fortunately mine have the flanges there at the back of the gearbox. One of the hardest parts in removing the exhaust is the rubber hangers. Make sure you take a little bit of the pressure off them with the jack so they're not actually hanging on the hangers. There's about 2, 4, 6, 8 of them on this particular top exhaust, or in this model. It does use this is an aftermarket exhaust, it does use the factory exhaust hangers, which is really good. One of the things that I really like about some aftermarket systems use the factory hangers. So now that the exhaust is out of the road, it's 18 and 19 mil bolt heads and nuts times 6 on each drive flange. So just showing you what I've been doing here. There you can see the damper with all 6 bolts removed. The front 3 are actually quite difficult to actually fully remove until you get the tail shaft out. Center bearings just held in by 2 14mm bolts. And now I'm showing you the very back flange up against the diff, and there's those hangers that I was talking about before. Sorry I didn't frame this real well, but just out of shot I'm taking out the two 14mm bolts that I showed you earlier, which hold the centre bearing up. Once that's out, then it's just a matter of flexing it out. So working on the last three bolts on the flange going into the diff. These ones are actually a star bolt and only 15mm, much smaller than the front ones, or at least the heads, the actual bolts are the same size. Okay, the back drive flange is nowhere near as bad as the one that came out of the front. The original one came out of the front. It was just about ready to fail. This one does have a little bit of cracking, but it's not too bad given its age. I guess it's not as heat soaked as what the front one is. These are the replacement ones, just from eBay, not genuine Holden. They seem to be pretty good. Here you can see the rubber is perished almost completely through on the centre bearing. That will cause that centre bearing to flop around, or the drive shaft to flop around under power. So because we've got to separate the two halves of the drive shaft, make sure you mark a line on the drive shaft, as you can see there, because you don't want it to be out of phase. They are balanced as an assembly. So to separate the two halves of the drive shaft, you need to mount the rear side of the uni joint flange in a solid vise and a solid bench, and the rear section of the drive shaft, then you hit it with a big hammer. Now, when you're putting it back on, very much like a CV joint, they have a spring clip that sits in here. If you sit it down, it sits with the seat open at the top. You can see that it sits down like that. So when you go to reinstall it, make sure it sits at the top, because then it sits down into the groove. It makes it much easier to put back on. Okay, to get the bearing off, the rubber on the old one is torn, so it's now over there. Clamp it in a vise around the bearing. There is this sort of rubbery outside on it, but clamp it so that you're not clamped onto the uni joint. Then using a brass drift on top, as you can see. A little bit of WD-40 in around the bearing surface as well. Being careful not to go out on the edges of the splines. No. And there she is. Now to get the new one on, square it up on top. You may have to tap it in on the inner bearing race. It is going just very slowly, so using a drift, a small drift, preferably brass if you've got one. My brass one's a bit too big, so I'm going to have to be careful with a steel one. Just tap down on the inner race there. This is going, it's just slow. I'm just using some molybdenum grease on the splines of the shaft before I rejoin the two halves of the tail shaft. Molybdenum grease is always better to use than standard grease in splined areas. Line up your marks. There. So what I've been struggling with is these hangers. That's the worst one. That one there on the right side, driver's side. And then it's just a matter of getting the clips on. Damn, I need a hoist. Well, that's it for the driveline repair. Changing of the centre bearing and the front and rear dampers. I don't know what they're called. It's a reasonably straightforward job. Probably the hardest part is getting the bearing off, as you saw, but a bit of patience, brass drift, make sure you don't damage those spines, and yeah, I think you'll be fine. Anyway, give it a go. You'll save yourself a couple $100 by not taking it to a mechanic. I can't wait to get a hoist. I'm sick and tired of lying on the ground. I'm getting too old for that. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Please like, share and subscribe, and see you on the next one.